Утреннего и важен первый шаг. Слышишь, ветер над страною, яростных атак. И вновь продолжает с тобой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Если ты во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. По милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щадит. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 7th of October, of course, 2025, and here we are with the live stream specifically looking at the events of 2 years ago, October the 7th, 2023, when in the early hours of that particular day, Palestinian fighters, principally from the Hamas organization, its military wing, but also including fighters from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others, stormed out of the prison camp known as Gaza and into the territory now known currently, much longer known as Israel. This operation had been apparently 2 years in the planning, at the very least, was organized under conditions of the strictest secrecy by the Palestinian resistance leaders within Gaza. The rest of the Hamas leadership, those based in Qatar, for instance, did not know about it. Ismail Haniyeh, the late Hamas leader, did not know about it. The Iranian leadership did not know about it. The Hezbollah leadership didn't know about it. Almost nobody did, outside of a tiny handful of organizers inside Gaza. It was planned apparently using very analog methods. They used deception to fool the Israeli watchers, often by turning those that have been recruited as spies by Israel and feeding false intelligence through them. In the end, it caught almost everybody by surprise. Now, I will deal in this particular episode with those who argue that the whole thing was a setup by Netanyahu or elements within Israel. I will make the argument that even if that is the case, that Mr. Netanyahu has not got what he was looking for out of this, nor will. What was started 2 years ago was, as the late Hassan Nasrallah, former General Secretary of Hezbollah, put it shortly afterwards in a speech he gave in November of 2023, the beginning of a very long struggle for the liberation of the entirety of the West Asian region, starting with, of course, Gaza and occupied Palestine, but also stretching to the rest of the region. As Nasrallah correctly pointed out, it was the beginning of a struggle to remove American and British influence over the region and remove their domination over the region. And for that reason, as Nasrallah correctly said, it is going to be a long and difficult war. And it was a war that, as I'm certain that Nasrallah would have expected, claimed his life and the life of many others in the Hezbollah leadership. But a war that continues to this day, for all Trump's thundering and blundering about his peace plan. It is a war that continues. And it is a war that the Israeli regime and its enthusiastic backers in the United States and Western Europe still have not been able to win. For all of their supposed technological advantages, they have not only not won, they have been repeatedly humiliated. And the fight has taken on an existential level of crisis for not only the Israeli regime, but ultimately its parent regime, US imperialism and British imperialism. So the comments I'm going to make tonight look a little bit at the history, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why, of course, those who resist occupation and colonization are right to do so. Now, just on the right of resistance, I mean, I would support the right of people to resist, whether it had a UN General Assembly resolution or Security Council resolution or was written down in international law, it would be right to support those struggling for national liberation against the imperialist powers, whether it was codified within international law or not. So what is the usage then of referencing particular UN resolutions? It is useful in the sense that it's useful to defend yourself legally against the oppressive forces of the British state. It's also useful, and American states, of course. It's also useful for throwing back at liberals who weep and wail about law one day, then back at genocide the other. Now, so when people say Palestinians have the right to armed resistance, what are they actually referring to? Refers to two specific resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly. One, Resolution 2625, 1970, which codifies this and says that there is a right to resist forcible foreign actions that deprive a people of their right to self-determination. That is exactly what the Israeli regime, of course, does. That's from 1970. And there's a more specific one from 1982, which is entitled 37/43, again, a UN General Assembly resolution, which affirms the legitimacy of a struggle for independence, national unity and liberation, and this can be waged by all available means, including armed struggle. And this was specifically written with reference to Namibia and Palestine all the way back in 1982. So in actual fact, the declarations of the United Nations General Assembly, of course, on the side of the people of Palestine and their right to resistance and their right to fight for a homeland of their own. Now, of course, many nations have done this, and the Zionist state, of course, claims that it was established through an act of national liberation. That was always fake. It was a fake liberation. It was in actual fact, it was built on the dispossession and murder of the Palestinian Arabs. It was never about national liberation, given that those people who came there to found the state of Israel all came from somewhere else. So the point about international law is, well, it's a useful thing to be able to throw at people who still believe in this stuff. You know, for people screaming about legal struggle, peaceful struggle, pacifism. Israel and the United States, particularly U.S. imperialism itself, have answered all attempts at legal, peaceful, pacifistic struggles with bullets and bombs and batons and arrest and torture. That's the way that the imperialist powers always respond to struggles with a pacifistic nature. It is only when they are threatened with, or indeed they have to fight and lose a national liberation struggle, but they suddenly remember that there are principles by which these things should be conducted. Now, just to give a couple of examples of necessary acts of revolutionary violence in the cause of national liberation, cite, of course, the Irish Easter Rising of 1916, which doctrinaire Marxists at the time denounced as adventurist, as a Blanquist uprising, as something which is outside of the Marxist tradition, which, of course, in certain respects, even given the dry, arid, and pro-imperialist nature of Second International Marxism, of what that had become, they were right in that it was a piece of Blanquist adventurism. But Lenin, in recognizing the importance of the Easter Rising in Dublin of 1916 and its after effects, realized that there needed to be a rethink on this. He realized the importance of the shots fired by the Irish at the British Empire, because it led to the first stage of the disintegration of the British Empire. It led to a war in Ireland that the British couldn't win and that they needed to negotiate their way out of. Yes, it ended in partition and many decades of struggle to come. But the first shots in the dissolving of the British Empire had already been fired. So this is the reason why, one of the reasons why Lenin regarded it as such an important act. And what the Easter Rising did was, of course, it empowered inside Britain. Inside Britain, it empowered the worst fascistic or proto-fascistic military elements to go wild in Ireland and commit all kinds of crimes. But it also inspired a wave of resistance, which ultimately led to the liberation. Jump forward 30 years into the late period of the 1940s, when you see the beginnings of the War of Resistance against French oppression in Algeria. Now, this, of course, as I've said before, the beginnings of this saw the French slaughter 40,000 people in a couple of weeks. We started with horrendous massacres committed by the French military when World War II was still going on. And this is, of course, cited by Francis Fanon, The Invention of the Earth. And it was, of course, a very horribly ironic thing that the Great War against fascism was going on when the French themselves were up to some Einsatzgruppen type activities inside Algeria. And in the end, the French killed 1 million Algerians in over a decade-long war, which the French lost in the end. They ultimately lost. And there was plenty of times in that struggle, as there is in the many protracted armed struggles, where the actions of the FLN, Front Libération Nationale, were regarded as being criminal, as being brutal, as being too violent, as having provoked the wrath of the French upon the civilian population. But ultimately, it was a struggle that was won. Now, just hang on a moment. I've got to pause to just adjust the microphone a second. Bear with me. Right, back again. So the uprising on October the 7th, 2 years ago, kicked off a wave of brutality and horror that has not ended yet. It still goes on to this day. But of course, the resistance goes on to this day. And it's important when we're discussing these things to remember that, because you can, if you just doom scroll through Twitter each day, you can forget that the armed resistance to US imperialism and its Israeli dog carries on every day and continues to score successes every day, that the Israeli military has been revealed to be a brutal gang of cowardly reactionaries incapable of defeating serious armed resistance, and only capable of brutalizing and killing large numbers of civilians. So the way in which I choose to look at it myself is that for all of the you can commit many, for all of the brutality that the Israelis are now legendary for, they still have not been able to uproot the Palestinian resistance. They could not defeat Hezbollah for all of the spectacular terroristic actions that they took in the pager attacks and then the elimination of the Hezbollah leadership. They still could not uproot Hezbollah from the southern border. They lost again there. And the killing of Nasrallah only reflected how desperate they were becoming, in that they thought that by taking out the leadership that would end Hezbollah as an organization. It is still there, and they still resist. Now, The fall of the Syrian government, the fall of the Syrian government was, of course, unexpected in some degree, but upon further study that I've done on it, the but it became clear as time went on that the balance of forces inside the Assad-led government had tilted against the resistance access and towards capitulation, which is ultimately what happened. It was the attack by the MI6 and Turkish-run HTS, led by Jelani, who is essentially a joint employee of Turkish and British intelligence. This attack was not all that powerful, but the reactionary forces inside the Assad government had hollowed out that government to the extent that the resistance collapsed very quickly. Which, of course, was a huge blow, but it was one that really the Israeli regime, for all of its and the US imperialists, for all their attempts to make a big progress in this area, all they managed to do is create swirling vortex of chaos, which, of course, they'll always take if the choice is between that or something they can't completely control. But ultimately, it'll be something which does not advance because they can't. These people can't build anything. They spent decades in Afghanistan, lost control of it overnight. They've spent decades in Iraq, even though their presence there is much smaller these days, and ultimately can't control very much of anything outside of the green zone. So their win in Libya, in heavy inverted commas, has only led to a situation where they have various armed factions vying for control over it. Ultimately, Libya will be something which falls into the multipolar camp. Ultimately, Syria, I think, will rise again. The legacy of the more positive legacies of Baathism will not be forgotten. The chaos created by the Jelani gangs will not win over the masses to their cause. And also the fact that Jelani is essentially a servant of London and Anglia will not ultimately do him any good. Maybe he'll end up sharing a mansion with Zelensky in some sort of hilarious sitcom. But the point being that in the 2 years since the uprising of October 7th, 2023, the overall result is a much considerably weakened Israeli regime and a weakened US imperialism. US imperialism had already been exposed badly by October 2023 as being unwilling and unable, of course, to pursue a direct war with the Russians. They were outsourcing that to the Ukrainians with the help of the British, and they were unable to effectively defend their Israeli satellite state from the response, missile-based responses of the Iranians, including the last segment of the war between U.S. imperialism / Israel and Iran, when it is alleged not only were a load of key military and intelligence targets hit, but quite a number of Israeli forces, Israeli troops were actually hit also by Iranian missiles. That's unconfirmed, and these, like a lot of things, is under very heavy military censorship inside Israel, which the Israeli government has, of course, been routinely hiding what is going on from its own population. So in the 2 years afterwards, after whatever agenda those inside Israel and inside the US had for the aftermath of that attack has not worked. The agenda, perhaps, that we can discern from the actions of both the Palestinian issue via mass ethnic cleansing, as they used to call it when it was done by those bad Serbs, apparently, 30 years ago. That was the agenda that was clearly in operation. Use the situation after October the 7th to carry out a mass expulsion of the Palestinian population into Egypt and Jordan, which of course they didn't count on or didn't figure into their calculation, the fact that even the regime of General Sisi, or the wretched king of Jordan, was not keen on the idea of being the beneficiary, shall we say, the host to millions of expelled Palestinians. The courage and resilience of the Palestinian people in refusing to be driven off their land, and of course the fear of the reactionary comprador leaders that looked at the masses and looked at the mood of the masses in their countries and realized that if they were seen to be collaborating in this crime, then their days might well be numbered. So it's important to remember all of this. It is important to remember that the removal of, again, to go back to the words of Hassan Nasrallah, the removal of American and British influence in West Asia was never going to be easy. The Americans, the British, and to a lesser extent the French, have dominated this region, have defined it, and defined the states that were born after World War II. Not just the Zionist regime, but the other countries as well, based on colonial era borders, dominated often by comprador cliques that were put into power by one imperialist power or another. Undoing all of that was never going to be just an act that would take a month, a year, or 2 years. It is a long war, a 2-year-long war, as somebody in the comments has put it, of Palestinian liberation, which rumbles on to this day. And it is a war that will see, unfortunately, as the Algerian war saw, as any war of liberation, such as the one we referenced earlier in Namibia, as the war for the liberation of the former Portuguese colonies, Angola and Mozambique, as the war for the liberation of places like Kenya saw. Imperialism will kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, in order to try and cling on. Just remember how many the French killed in Algeria, how many did American imperialism kill in Korea or in Vietnam, how many did Japanese imperialism kill all the way across the countries it tried to conquer in the long war between 1931 and 1945. How many did British imperialism burn, maim, shoot, and starve to death in the long period of domination of India? The removal of these oppressive powers is never easy. People, the imperialist powers themselves, like to stress that the final stage of negotiations, followed by a handshake, a move to the neo-colonial period. But before that, in the case of every country that freed itself, there was a long and brutal struggle, and countless people, many of whom remain nameless and known to no one other than their families, died horribly at the hands of the imperialists and their servants in order to make the liberation process possible. So this is what is going on in Palestine, what has gone on in Gaza, is nothing new. It's new in terms of the technologies of horror that the Israeli regime has deployed. The brutality of imperialism, in terms of the intensity of struggle, in terms of the treachery and perfidious nature of the compradors, this is not new. This is what should have been expected. And what we're seeing in Gaza, and we will see elsewhere before this struggle is concluded, is just how bad imperialism could really be, just how brutal it can be, just how relentless it can be in terms of its willingness to slaughter thousands and thousands every single week, or in fact sometimes every day, in order to retain the position that it has. And if you think for a moment that they would hesitate before doing the same thing to us, then you're fooling yourself. They would do the same thing to us if they were challenged in a fundamental way. Because bear in mind, and here I'll get into the talk of like, well, what did Netanyahu know and what did Netanyahu plan? There is every chance that the Israeli government expected some kind of incursion, some kind of attack. They probably did expect something, given that they've been warned. There were other factors involved, though, such as Netanyahu was more concerned at that moment in time. I mean, we'll get to Netanyahu's role in just a minute. Though he was more concerned back in 2023 with the plan to try and annex the West Bank. That was why he was diverting military resources into the West Bank to try and carry out his annexation plan. This, again, is one of those plans that ultimately will not work. For all that Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Kurdish Peter Griffin are very keen on this. So there is that fact. There is also the fact that they thought that something would happen, but not on the scale that it was, not on the scale that it did happen. Perhaps they expected a smaller scale incursion. They didn't expect the resistance to take quite as many prisoners of war. They didn't expect the resistance to go as far into Israel as they did. And they certainly didn't expect it to have the galvanizing effect that it did. So maybe there was something to the idea, to the explanation that the certain elements within the Israeli regime were prepared to look the other way in order to try and gain an advantage after the events had occurred and pushing their own ideas. I would also posit that there is also every chance that certain people in the Israeli military and intelligence hierarchy didn't or were willing to take a punt on this uprising going ahead in order to weaken Netanyahu. Bear in mind, before October the 7th, 2023, the Israeli regime had been gripped by a huge internal political crisis, divided down the middle over various different things, including like constitutional reform, the nature of the Jewish state, etc. And there is every chance that there are people inside the military and intelligence hierarchy who were willing to essentially look the other way in the hope that Netanyahu himself would be destroyed, politically destroyed by this, which is one of the reasons why Netanyahu absolutely will not stop the war, because it is only his attempts to prosecute the war to what appears to be a victorious conclusion that keeps him where he is. If he gets anything less than what he promised, then politically speaking, it'll be very damaging for him, may even be all over. The other thing that's been revealed is the sheer political weakness of Israel, because now you have Netanyahu hanging on grimly with his coalition of the psychotic accountant Smotrich and Kurdish Peter Griffin. But in reality, like, that's a very fragile alliance between some very unstable political forces, and no one else inside the Israeli political system has any better chance of pulling together any kind of stable government. It is a basket case now. Not only has the army been revealed to be very weak and incapable of defeating determined resistance, but also the economy has been severely damaged. If the reputation of Israel was pretty low in the world anyway, it's sunk to the point where it is residing in the very lowest circle of hell. So all of this has done an extreme amount of damage to the Israeli regime. And it may, again, like, the war will be a long one, but it will end ultimately with an Israeli defeat. and by extension, a US defeat. Now, the US regime is, of course, desperate for that not to happen. They've got severe problems of their own. They've got problems of their own in Ukraine. They've got problems of their own with regard to their attempts to contain the Chinese, which has thus far completely and utterly failed. And they've got problems that with regard to the rest of West Asia in their repeated and failed attempts to try and generate a color revolution in Iran, all of which have run into the ground. So imperialism is stretched. It has been weakened much further by the enormous and heroic self-sacrifice carried out by the Palestinian National Liberation Forces. And ultimately, this struggle continues. And the struggle will continue regardless of what Trump says, regardless of whatever ceasefire agreements he tries to impose on Gaza. Hamas apparently has refused to Trump's demand that they disarm. And it is a fact that the Israelis have revealed themselves to be, as I said, incapable of defeating Hamas and the other Palestinian liberation forces, militarily speaking. They've completely failed to do so. And as John Elmer has reported on the Electronic Intifada, every time they run into the National Liberation Forces in Gaza, the Israelis suffer an embarrassing disaster. So what has been revealed is an Israeli regime which is coming to be bankrupt, which has been revealed to be just purely something which only exists via the constant bankrolling of it by the United States. It's revealed a United States which is overstretched and unable to defend the skies above Israel if it gets into another war with Iran, which of course it will inevitably do. And ultimately, it's revealed imperialism to be, the paper tiger that Mao always insisted that it was. And so, when looking at the events of October 7th, analyze it in that way. Because if you just go through the immense losses, the barbarity of imperialism, and you don't take in a proper, a more wider analysis, then you're just going to end up depressed. But the fact is that the Israeli regime and US imperialism and British imperialism have all been massively weakened by the events of October the 7th, 2023. So no matter what plan Netanyahu or some Israeli intelligence operatives or the CIA or MI6 might have had in the aftermath of October the 7th, it has only led to them being weakened. And ultimately, it is the starting point of a new wave of revolutions inside West Asia that will only conclude with the expulsion of the imperialists from the West Asian region. Right. Let's have a look at the comments here. See who we've got. So be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. So we are going to go through comments and to answer any questions we've got. So who do we have here? We have Jace Hart. We have Sophia. Good evening or good afternoon to both of you. We have Nemo. We have the Wicked Witch of the Southeast. We have Jerry. Nemo says, Star equating protesting the Palestinian genocide as showing disrespect to the memory of those killed in the Manchester synagogue attack, particularly sickening even coming from him. Well, yes, I mean, the fact is also that those killed, the two of those killed in the attack were shot by the police. I mean, as even the Greater Manchester Police have had to admit to. So who's supposed to be showing respect and why again? I mean, it's cynical opportunism. Anything to try and make the Palestine movement look bad, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Even like the liberal end of the Palestine solidarity movement is refusing to buy it, to take that bait. So the demonstrations will continue, and no matter what Shabana Mahmood, the latest prize idiot who's in the Home Secretary's chair, tries to do, the demonstrations will continue to grow, and the political situation for the Labour government will continue to deteriorate. Good. If it leads to if October the 7th and the demonstrations against US imperialism and its Israeli proxy continue much longer, continue to weaken the Labour Party and leads to its destruction, then it's another positive legacy of October the 7th. Hello to Mike Patrick out there in New England. Hello to Almir in Slovenia, Yugoslavia. Hello to Bruce Albert, who says, good news from Kerala State. India's Communist Party Marxists won 113 of 132 in State Assembly. I didn't know that. I'll have to check that out. Let me just make a note of that. Hello to Alan Chavez. Hello to Will Johnson. Hello to Walter Stolzing. Hello to Comrade Lee. David Berry from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Yarnap One. Sid. Pat from Bristol. Abtin. David, who says 76 years ago the GDR was founded. Well, if only it was still with us, comrade. Hello to Eduardo. Hello to Nikki. Exodus. Almir's liking the Palestine Scotland flag. Yes, it is an excellent flag. You can order it online. I recommend you all do so. Hello to Pittsburgh Dude and President Jesus. One thing I would just say about the famed Israeli surveillance systems, just on the question of like, oh, well, how did they miss the force of the buildup forces? Now, there's some chance that that they deliberately missed it, but also always bear in mind that the Israeli surveillance tech is essentially being sold on, the idea that it's invulnerable, or it always finds what it's looking for. There's every chance that having tested themselves against the surveillance tech for years, and the Palestinians could have developed at least a few countermeasures against it. What the Israelis say their tech is capable of, what it is actually capable of, are two different things. Like the Americans, the US constantly says, we've got the best weapons in the world, we've got the best this in the world, the best that in the world. These are all sales pitches. Fundamentally, what they always underestimate is the ability of the oppressed people to counter their incredible technology. And there's every chance that the Palestinians could have at least developed some countermeasures against this. Don't underestimate. When are you going to put some respect on the Grenada Revolution? When I have time, basically. It's an interesting. The Grenadian Revolution is an interesting historical event. I mean, I don't know enough about it to do a program on it as yet, but I will look into it now you've made a point of asking. Just that in there. Another heroic triumph for US imperialism, boldly invading an island nation with no army. Hello to Dimitri. Hello to Zama from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to Davey. Nayat says, the Zionists accomplished dominance in the Anglo-Saxon world, or will civil resistance prevail ultimately? I think that's the wrong way of putting it. With respect. The position of the Zionists in Britain right now is very weak in terms of their actual position within the country. Now, what's happened is what is sort of a weird thing has occurred, which is that what has been going on inside like the occupied six counties of Ireland for years, which is like the loyalist paramilitary types waving their Israel flags. That was something which was sort of regarded as an oddity for years, because of course the loyalist paramilitaries adopted like the anti-communist countries, basically the sort of settler colonial regimes, fascistic regimes as their heroes. So apartheid South Africa, you see their flag in loyalist areas of Belfast. You see the flag of old white Rhodesia, and you see also like South Vietnam, Taiwan, and you see Israel. Like the five granddaddies are like anti-communism. You see them, the big US puppet states, most of which now don't exist anymore, at least not in the same way. But the loyalists always adopted them as like their sort of their icons. Now you've got like the reactionaries inside Britain have all adopted the cause of Zionism as their own, which is strange in some respect, because like the British fascists, as was like the BNP, British National Party, the old National Front, were always they were always anti-Jewish, and people like Nick Griffin were always anti-Israel. Now, what's changed is that a lot of the Zionists themselves, and you can tell this from the actions of the Netanyahu government, they put a lot into winning over fascistic types to their cause. Now, of course, none of these people like Stephen Yaxley Lenin and co actually like Jews very much, but they do like Zionism. Distinction to be made there. Just as it is, it is true that to be a Zionist does not necessarily mean to be a Jew, nor is it true that every Jew is a Zionist. But also it is true that not everybody who is a Zionist likes Jews. So there are plenty of anti-Semitic Zionists, including Arthur Balfour, people like that, who wanted to back Zionism for their own reasons related to colonialism, finding a reliable bunch of settlers who could do some dirty work for the British in West Asia. The point is that the reactionary, as the position of British imperialism has deteriorated, the tactics used by the British in the north of Ireland to a certain extent come home, which is now that the Israeli regime is under siege and is regarded as by the reactionaries, quite correctly from their point of view, as being at the front line of a sort of a war that is waged against the influence of British imperialism. You see all the reactionaries uniformly now endorsing and embracing Israel, other than like a few sort of rather more sort of traditional fascist types. So the flag of Israel being everywhere amongst the reactionaries is not a surprise, because Israel acts like your average petty reactionary wishes the British state would act towards, well, take your pick, Arabs, people from descended from historically what was once known as British India, so people with Pakistani, Bangladeshi descent, etc., or just anybody not white. I mean, that's fundamentally what a lot of these people believe in. So Israel's been adopted by the sort of petty reactionary fascist types as another state that is like they wish Britain was, like white South Africa was, like white Rhodesia was. That's what gets a lot of these people animated, and also it is in terms of the strength of that. I mean, is pro-Israel sentiment, Zionist sentiment, is strong in like elite circles. So generally, like it's you go to areas that have more money, you're more likely to find serious money. Not just middle class stuff. Like go to areas that have serious money, you're more likely to find some pro-establishment, therefore pro-Israeli beliefs. Then certain areas of the petty bourgeoisie, you find very strong pro-Israel support. But the great bulk of the population, as seen on those who will mobilize and those who will get out and protest in solidarity with Palestine, and amongst the British population, if you believe the opinion polls, it's very much a case that the population is, broadly speaking, of a pro-Palestinian viewpoint. The pro-Israeli viewpoint, though, is overly represented, of course, because it's the viewpoint of the ruling class. Because the ruling class and their more, shall we say, observant servants, they're more able servants, know very well what the effect will be if the Israeli regime goes down. Now, if you just bear with me a moment, I'm just going to pause to grab a drink of water, then I'm going to continue. Be back with you in 2 minutes. Right, hello everybody. Back with you again. So the just the question on like Britain. I mean, it's revealed also what many of us knew, but I think it's revealed much more widely amongst the population. Just the nature of the leadership of the Labour Party. I mean, this was clear to anybody who'd studied it for any amount of time. But the fact that like Starmer has like responded to the protest by trying to like ban various different groups, including of course Palestine Action, send people to prison for months or years for spray painting, put people on trial for like holding entirely peaceful protests and charge them with hate crimes and terrorism. And it's not working. It's not working. It's not discouraging people. It's like reveal the hollowness and emptiness of like the Labour Party, and the hollowness and emptiness of Starmer himself. He's just a pure reactionary. And he's not even a reactionary who's particularly interesting. He's just doing the bidding of the most extreme elements in like the state machine. Now, as Mohammed notes in the comments, according to Matt Kennard, MI6 opposed the prescription of Palestine Action. Opinion of MI5 is unknown. What do you make of this? Is the UK elite and security establishment split on how to contain dissent? Yes, I mean, but it's interesting that MI6 have let their opinions be known to Declassified UK. I think that's quite an interesting, something I've suspected for quite some time, which is that Declassified UK have a, shall we say, an interesting relationship with certain sources within MI5 and MI6. Now, maybe it's always, I mean, given that the Declassified UK's mission statement is basically to cover the kind of stories that the Guardian used to cover before it was just completely subsumed into the state propaganda structure. I mean, it shouldn't be exactly a surprise that they would talk to people within MI5 and MI6. And I think one of the reasons why Declassified UK and other sites like it are allowed to continue is that, yeah, there are those within the security services who find it very useful to leak out information to certain alternative news websites every now and again, particularly if they want to embarrass or weaken a government that they've had enough of. And it's clear that a certain section of the British state machine and the British political establishment have had enough of Keir Starmer and think that he's, no longer credible and should be got rid of. That's why, like, stories that have been floating around for years and years about the dirty tricks of his principal advisor, Morgan McSweeney, is suddenly all over the press. It's why Mandelson was sacked from his position as British ambassador to the United States for stuff that everybody knew about. Now, there was nothing new that was revealed about Mandelson. It was just that somebody inside, like the establishment, decided to flick a switch and say, okay, now, lads, you can make an issue out of this. And suddenly the media made a big issue of it, and Starmer was obliged to sack Mandelson. And again, everything about Mandelson was known when he was appointed. So Starmer, again, just gets revealed time and time again to not only have poor judgment, but to have no independent judgment. That's the thing about him. With a creature like Blair, who is fucking evil. I hesitate to use biblical language, but like, the man is a biblical level of evil. But there is, you always have the feeling that Blair himself had, come to these opinions because of, a close identification of his own class interests with that of British imperialism, of course. But also, like, he was capable of developing his thoughts himself. Starmer is just an empty vessel. He's an empty vessel into which the foul creations of Tony Blair and the rest of the British establishment get poured in. And the banning of Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act was a really unnecessary and really stupid maneuver, which you have to wonder what, if any, thoughts were going through his head, going through Yvette Cooper's head, because you don't need to be a political genius to work out what will happen if you ban an entirely peaceful group that basically just like do some machine smashing, do some spray painting. You ban them and try and throw them in jail. It's going to generate, in the middle of like a genocide, it's going to generate more opposition to you than you have eliminated by banning. So it's turned out to be a massive miscalculation. The fact that MI6 have decided that this doesn't look good and therefore we're going to let it be known that we don't like it is interesting. Was it MI5 that demanded the banning? That's an interesting question. I mean, I never underestimate the wildly reactionary nature of those who run MI5. But it's interesting that Starmer has gone as far as he has with trying to repress the Palestine Solidarity. Were those the demands of the security service? Maybe. Certainly, given the track record of like MI5's senior officers, it's certainly the case that you can believe that they would make the very reactionary demands. Was this the demand of the senior police officers? Again, it's possible. Or was it the demand of those ultra-reactionary who Starmer serves in the wider political establishment? Again, that's possible. We won't know where the demand fully where that demand came from for quite some time. But it's interesting that essentially MI6 have decided to undermine Starmer by basically openly coming out and saying they don't agree with it, which is what they've done by communicating it to Declassified UK. And the fact that they've gone to Declassified UK also says a lot. That there are some people within the British intelligence establishment who have decided that Israel is a losing bet and going all in to defend this is not actually doing them much good, domestically speaking or internationally speaking. But they're all stuck because what the reactionaries are right about is that if Israel goes, then British influence in West Asia goes with it, because it won't be too long after Israel goes that the eye of history turns upon the Gulf tyrannies, the Saudi tyranny, and those are the other pillars of remaining British influence in the region. And if Israel goes down, then they'll probably be next. So imperialism is stuck. Some of them probably think that if they change policy now, that they can negotiate themselves into a better position with whatever goes on next. But in all reality, if they pull support from Israel and Israel implodes, then it will be an uncontrollable escalation of the situation from there. So imperialism is in a corner, and they can't find a way out very easily. Right. So to answer Nehat's question, the mood in Britain is split. Like those, the mood in Britain is split, but with the masses are more on the side of the Palestinians. The ruling class, the political establishment, the media establishment are much more on the side of imperialism, and therefore they are they're very much on the side of Israel. And it will be interesting to see how that division plays itself out, because it's that the support for the Palestinian cause is only going to strengthen as time goes on, and support for Israel is going to become unacceptable, apart from like the ultra reactionaries who may well come to government in a few years' time, but in the form of Farage and co. But I wouldn't bet on that too firmly for now. More on that in future episodes. Almir says Israel and the US have a major problem. They want to do what the Americans, Canadians, and Australians did to indigenous people, almost total extinction, but extermination. But historically speaking, they're too late. Yes, they would like ideally to do that, but they can't. They would like to have done that in 1948, but they were unable to. They'd like to do it now, but they're still unable to. So yes, settler colonialism's time is over. And what caused it to perish was many factors, but I would argue principal amongst them is the long-term effects of the October Revolution, which galvanized the anti-imperialist movement, globally speaking, to the point where it was almost impossible to maintain settler or set up new settler colonies. Part of the reason why sort of the foaming at the mouth mad reactionaries are so angry about the fate of Israel and so panicked about it is that it's the last one standing. It's the last settler colony. If that goes, then imperialism, its old classic form, is gone forever. So it's the last one standing. It's Rhodesia's gone, South Africa's gone, all the other white settler colonial attempts in Africa have gone. this is the last one. And once that's gone, that's all over. It's for the history books. Zamar says, Hamas asking for release of PFLP in Sudan is based. Yeah, very good observation there. Abolish NATO says, Mercuris today said he hasn't seen any censorship coming from the right. Well, I don't know what he's smoking, to be completely honest. Good evening to David Greenwood. We are many with our views. Says, but is there any chance that the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class will join together? I think not. Some Trotskyist groups are still advocating this. Well, they're advocating for a fantasy. Truth be told. I mean, it sounds great, doesn't it? You say we must unite the entire working class, Palestinian, Israeli, to come together to jointly overthrow the capitalist class. Sounds great. Until you realize that where things stand right now, it's an absolute impossibility. The Israeli working class is too tied to settler colonialism to engage in that kind of action. There are a minority, I must say this, of Israelis who do properly oppose the genocide and who do essentially want to live in a one-state solution and dismantle Zionism because they've had enough of it and can see that it's dooming them. But they're a tiny minority, unfortunately. The great bulk of the Israeli population will not only stick with Zionism, but stick with it in its most brutal and obscene form for the foreseeable future. And to ask an oppressed people to carry on basically being sledgehammered by imperialism and the Zionist regime, whilst you try and construct this theoretical unity of the working class, and to ask them to not resist very much if whilst that continues, that's lunacy. More to the point, this feeds into our next featured guest on this program, which is a certain Zoran Mamdani. You may be familiar with him. He's going to be the next mayor of New York, don't you know? And I think that the Trotskyite and the reformist position that basically nothing should be done that upsets anybody or that upsets imperialism is the most sort of disgusting respectability politics, dressed up in ultra-left language in the case of the Trotskyites. So to ask a oppressed people not to resist while you pursue your theoretical unity of the working class is nonsense. It is garbage. It is just the kind of like second international nonsense that Lenin, Stalin, Mao, etc. always stood against. Here I'll turn to Mamdani, who I wanted to mention, who has been, of course, attacked by the American reactionaries as being basically the leader of Hamas, to which I can respond, well, if only. He is, of course, Bernie Sanders with the tan. Now, aside from the awful color scheme and lettering that looks like it was taken off a glam rock album in the mid-1970s, this statement is a disgrace, and I'll read it to you and tell you why it is. Mamdani says the following: 2 years ago, Hamas carried out a horrific war crime, killing more than 1,100 Israelis and kidnapping 250 more. I mourn these lives and pray for the safe return of every hostage still held and for every family whose lives were torn apart by these atrocities. So there you go. Zoran Mamdani takes what I'm going to call the Trotskyite line on this. Now, for a start, he repeats, and this is just in the first paragraph, every single piece of pro-Israeli propaganda about the October the 7th attacks. The killing of more than 1,100 Israelis. Well, in actual fact, most of the killing there was done by the Israelis themselves, as has been admitted in the Israeli press. Like, they applied the Hannibal Directive. They blew up huge numbers of Israelis who have been taken prisoner. They launched missiles on them from helicopter gunships to kill them rather than have them be taken prisoner. This has been established, but Mamdani is still repeating 2-year-old Hasbara talking points. Now, as for the kidnapping, Again, like, there were civilians taken. Most of those have been released now. Most of those who still remain in captivity in Gaza were service personnel. They were Israeli army personnel. That's who the great bulk of those taken prisoner were. So, like, again, to say that, oh, well, they were kidnapped. No, these were soldiers serving in an army of occupation who were taken prisoner during an act of war. That's who they are. So, again, he's repeating every single piece of nonsense. He then goes on to condemn Netanyahu in the weakest possible terms and say we must have an unwavering commitment to universal human rights. Okay, well, how are we weighing the right of the oppressor and the right of the oppressed, Mr. Mamdani? How is that to be weighed? How are the rights of the settlers to be weighed against the rights of those they dispossess? How are the rights of the Israeli soldiers to be weighed against the rights of those resisting them? How are you going to have this wonderful, unwavering commitment to universal human rights? What happens when you get these two groups of rights clashing? Because between equal rights, force decides, as an old saying goes. So this is the kind of gibberish that the social democrats in the United States come up with. This is the kind of absolute nonsense that they talk. They condemn, and it's the same week, by the way, Mamdani has condemned Cuba and has condemned Venezuela as terrible dictatorships. Essentially, this guy is not even as radical as the younger version of Bernie Sanders. And as Marius says in the comments, universal human rights like Gorbachev disposing of anti-imperialism in the name of universal human values. Yeah. Where is the human values of imperialism? Well, where are the human values displayed by US imperialism when it not only enables the Israeli barbarities in Gaza, but also provoked and maintains and sustains the war in Ukraine, which has led to the death of over 1 million Ukrainians, apparently. Where was the universal humanity there? Where's the universal values? Where's the shared fucking values there? This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. You can talk about shared values, you can talk about the unity of humanity and all that. When imperialism has been defeated, then you have a chance to build a world based on shared values and shared humanity. You can't have a shared world with imperialism. You can't share values with the imperialists. Their only value is the dollar, the pound, and the euro. Their only value is in the ability to extract value from you, to extract large amounts of value from you and your country by ripping it off. That's their only value. You can't have shared values. If you do share value with these people, it's because you yourself, Mr. Mamdani, are an imperialist, just like Bernie fucking Sanders. This human rights doctrine nonsense is liberal crap that was designed to disarm communist movements. And unfortunately, it successfully did so. It's completely bourgeois nonsense, separated out from class struggle, separated out from the anti-imperialist struggle. It is used only to attack genuine socialist systems, genuine revolutionary processes like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Cuba, all of which people like Mamdani and the DSA denounced. So these people, these fucking DSA creeps, like, what the fuck is the point of that? Because it's not just the case that they're going to capitulate and sell out and lie about, join in with the pro-imperialist propaganda about against resistance movements and actual socialist countries. They won't, even if you think somewhere in your head, if Mr. DSA guy out there, or sorry, MX DSA non-binary out there watching this, even if you think that that's acceptable, which I've heard social democrats say this before, that it's acceptable to sell out on the anti-imperialist front in order to get domestic reforms. They some of them do think that. You're not even going to get that out of Mamdani, out of St. Bernard, out of AOCIA. You're not even going to get any of that because US imperialism and its ruling class are completely unwilling and unable to give you any reforms. So you'll get jack shit you'll sell out for nothing. Well, I'm sure not for nothing. I'm sure Bernie and his bank account will do pretty well, his retirement fund, and I'm sure AOCIA will rack up the expense claims, and I'm sure Mamdani will go on to work for a think tank somewhere. But the American worker will be left absolutely nowhere by these people. And just on the subject of anti-Assad Syrians, about whom much has said, by the way, it was an anti-Assad Syrian who was the guy who was reported to have done the attack at the synagogue the other day. Not coming out about him now. More on that later in later programs. But like anti-Assad Syrians basically have deserved nothing but essentially. Let's just say it as it is. These people, often whilst sitting comfortably in the West, have condemned their own the nation of their birth or the nation of their parents to oblivion. That's what they've done. That's what they've done by supporting the British puppet regime that's been imposed there. This is the legacy of anti-Assad Syrians. Well fucking done. These people deserve nothing but contempt. Just the same way, by the way, that the Trotskyites, the anarchists, everybody, all the other anti-Assad types and the fucking left deserve nothing but contempt. Because the truth was out there for them to discover. If they bothered to read anything other than the drivel that is printed in their press, if they bothered to have any more, the remotest amount of intellectual curiosity, they would have discovered who was behind the rebels and why the British and the American governments were just so keen on them. So if you find yourself on the same side as the British and the American imperialists and the French imperialists, if you're on their side, then your side has something wrong with it. And then it's not something which is going to benefit the people of the country you proclaim so much that you care about. Now, I do notice that none of these people are running to go and live in Jelani, Syria. I do wonder why. Anyway, we move on. Juan says the Palestinian resistance has torn down the pillar on which Zionist project relied for decades. Very true. Just go on through the comments here. What's Changed is sponsoring Tommy's Snow Fund, as a reference to Mr. Yaxley Lennon, and his habits regarding, shall we say, certain products of native South American plants. Let's just see. DSA comes out of Trotskyism. Yep, Michael fucking Harrington, an acolyte of Max Shachtman. The DSA is ultimately descended from the Trotskyites, who sided with U.S. imperialism in the Vietnam War. Max Shachtman ended up back, even leaving the Democrats behind because they weren't anti-communist enough for it. That's your Trotskyite legacy right there. Maria says Chris Coutron should vote for Mamdani. Yes, very true. Just on the subject of other leftists, I did promise to comment on a certain Mr. Chris Hedges, who basically sees his role as going around permanently mourning the death of the Palestinian nation. Well, the Palestinian nation will not die. And in fact, the Palestinian nation will look back ultimately on the events of the last 2 years to see that it was the beginning of the end of the Zionist regime. And ultimately the triumph of the Palestinian resistance, and ultimately the beginning of the liberation of the region. And so I did promise an impression of a certain Mr. Chris Hedges. So it's still in the workshopping stage. So I'm going to just I'm going to give you a little sample of what I'm working on at the moment. It may be wildly inaccurate, but I'm hoping that I hit the right tone. As we sit here and look, I imagine over and over again, Saul on the way to Damascus. I think of myself being struck down by an element of truth and turning to face the audience and proclaiming why must I suffer through this endless podcast cycle? I must go on and bear witness to the horrible fate of all those who raise arms against the empire, for the empire is my God, even though it is a God I have fallen out with. I must go on and bear witness and flagellate not me, but other people who do the writing for me on my podcast. For it is written in the book of Job, amen, etc., etc. It's not great. I'm going to workshop it further, but essentially, it's going to be added to the roster of impressions that is going to be debuted further, shall we say? Yeah, I'm going to work on it further. You got to get the sort of whether you're doing a Chris Hedges impression, you have to get the sort of preachy tone of a sort of Protestant minister who basically just says that every form of resistance is doomed, which is what Hedges does, which is why I have absolutely no time for him. That and the religious anti-communism, the fact that like he still to this day references Solzhenitsyn as a good thing. Quite why you can look at the world after the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, and look at what happened in those countries and beyond it, and still see it as a positive thing, which is what Hedges and people like him do. You look at all the disasters that have followed, all the horrors, and you can still sit there and say, Solzhenitsyn is a great man, a man who saw the truth about communism. It's ludicrous that you can still sit there and claim that. It's insane. Sid says, I'm convinced that Hedges is a state actor. He's the government's leftist. If you've been around in the New York Times for as long as he was, you're certainly on good terms, shall we say, with the state. President Jesus says needs to be more pretentious. True. Mario's preferred the Danny Shore impression. Well, that was easier to do because all you've got to do with that is to sort of put yourself in the mind of someone who thinks he's Eminem. And you just got to talk for your teeth like this. You got to talk for your teeth and say, no motherfucker's going to mess with me in my hood like this. Easy. Hedges is more difficult because Danny Shore doesn't enunciate. He just sort of speaks through his teeth. And if you speak through your teeth, the impression's quite easy. When you've got a sort of pretentious enunciation of a Protestant minister, it's harder to do. Okay, I'm going to draw things to a close because I have to go actually cook my cookbook things for this evening now. But we will return to you again tomorrow in the form of the Decline and Fall show, where we're going to be looking at various different things, including the autobiography of Jens Stoltenberg, former NATO Secretary General, which has been serialized in The Guardian. We will be looking at that tomorrow. There will be impressions of Donald Trump, Jens Stoltenberg, Vladimir Zelensky, Boris Johnson, and many, many others in our mine and Kit Clarenberg's live reading from the autobiography of Jens Stoltenberg. Be sure to join us for that. I will be back with you again on Thursday of this week for another live stream. So be sure to join me for that as well. Thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Could not do this work without you. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow us on X and on Rumble, Twitch, Kick, etc. so that if we do get booted off YouTube, there are alternatives. Again, join me again for the Decline and Fall show tomorrow. And now I give you over to your usual Lenin-centered video outro.
Утренний мостяк, жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, едет над страною ветры яростных атак. И власть продолжает с тобой, и сердцу тревога. Вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.